Alright, y'all, so today I'm going to review the 1999 film that aired for TV, the Civil War film, The Hunley, that aired back in the day on TNT. I've heard a lot of people said that they were showing this movie during class for like educational purposes, and all this and that. Now, I've seen a lot of Civil War movies, and, I typically don't necessarily like to view certain things, especially with the Confederacy and the Civil War, with sympathetic eyes, because, like I said, if you know what the Confederacy fought for at the end of the day or why it was founded, it's pretty immoral. But it doesn't mean that you can't make movies with Confederate soldiers, people. I mean, at the end of the day, they were all humans with all their different motivations. And, a talented filmmaker can make a sympathetic, maybe not like sympathetic to their cause, but something that maybe we can relate a little bit to what they were trying to do. And in this case, this is the film about the CSS Hunley, not the first submarine ever created. There was many attempts before, but arguably the first submarine to actually be successful in combat, obviously sinking a wooden Union warship at the beginning of 1864. And this movie tells the story of that. It tells the journey of the third attempt and the third crew, so to speak, that used the Hunley and eventually was successful in their mission, but ultimately died as a result. And the main character follows by the name of Dixon. He was, kind of overseen and commanded by PGT Beauregard. I can't say his name correctly, but one of the more famous Confederate generals in the Civil War, to basically head up this project and get a crew together, get this submarine operational, and essentially use it to break the Union blockade in Charleston, which by this point in 1864 hadn't yet been overrun by Union forces, but there was still a very intense and controlling Union blockade. So the Confederates are pretty desperate for anything to break this blockade. And the submarine, while obviously extremely early in its infancy in life, seemed like the most plausible way to do so. They would usually hit a torpedo and it would blow up the ship. Now, despite the fact that this is a 90s TV movie, I am very impressed by the quality of this thing. The CGI, the special effects are all really good and solid. I'm going to go, of course, into the pros and cons of this movie and give you my thoughts on it. But I think overall, I did like this movie quite a bit. Now, I don't think it's amazing. There are some weird things about it I don't like. But for what it's trying to do and just the story about the submarine, it's interesting. I thought that all the actors also did a pretty good job for the most part. We get to see Dixon, who's like the main character, and I really liked his story, especially when we get to learn more about the flashbacks, which I think were shown in a very nice way in this kind of, black and white style, which, there's kind of, like I said, apparently there's this whole thing with him and this coin, who he apparently had this coin that was, like I said, allegedly, we don't know for sure, was given to him by his girlfriend. He got shot during the Battle of Shiloh, which was one of the most bloodiest battles in the Civil War. But the coin actually protected his leg against the bullet, and I think it hit his hip bone or something, so it made him a bit harder to walk, but it didn't destroy his leg. And it kind of became, very famous, kind of part of the legend of the Hunley. It actually was bent, and, kind of part of the character of Dixon. We get to see him struggle with the loss of his wife. In a lot of ways, completing this mission, operating the submarine, I guess you can view it as somewhat of a, suicide quest of sorts to him in a kind of deeper metaphorical sense. But regardless, it is very interesting. I really liked his character. It, once again, didn't endorse the Confederate cause to a certain degree. It just made me more sympathetic to the character's struggles. Also, the crew characters that he gathers around are also really interesting. I thought the Irishman character was pretty funny. The character who was so, kind of so loyal to his wife was kind of interesting. I would have liked to know a little bit more about the others, but it was still overall really good. And I think all the actors in general do a great job. Even the guy that they got to play PGT Beauregard, which I believe Donald Sutherland, a guy who's been in a lot of movies and shows. played him, which I don't know if he looks like the real Beauregard general, but he was fine. I guess he did his role decently. He had a very good scene with Dixon later in the movie. Now, I do think the movie's well structured, it's well paced, it's only an hour and a half. It doesn't overstay its welcome. The visual effects are really good. The Hunley itself is really faithfully recreated from what it seems like. And it's really interesting. I thought it was really good. And I actually thought the whole messages about life, death, especially of Dixon's character, and his grief and loss over the death of his wife and the ultimate death at the end of this movie for him is very interesting. The special effects are all really good, like I mentioned. The CGI, even solid. And I think, too, there's a lot of really good moments. It's very accurate, too, for the most part, for the time period in the Civil War. I don't think, too, for a lot of other things, it's very subtle in its accuracies, right? There's not too many things that are inaccurate. There's some things that, from what I understand, are a little bit inaccurate just because at the end of the day, we don't exactly know how the Hunley sank. There's been multiple theories and books, and you have to remember this was made in 1999. You know, the Hunley had just been discovered, I believe, in 1995. In the year 2000, it was taken up, and then they had like a military funeral for all the people involved, and there's been just, like I said, we were able to finally analyze the wreck, look at it, get into really why the submarine sank. And even to this day, it's quite difficult since there's not really too much conclusive evidence. I mean, this happened over 100 years ago, for Christ's sakes. But it was very inaccurate, or accuracies are really good in this movie. The uniforms look good. The setting looks really good. Even the Confederate funeral at the beginning of the movie with the accurate Confederate flags with the stainless banner was very much a nice thing to see. Also, the plans, the look, how the events proceeded was really cool. Even the subtle details like the slaves that were impressed to clean up and actually repair the Hunley, which after the second crew got in and all died and sank, the crew of slaves were brought up to help winch it back onto the surface, clean it, get rid of all the dead bodies, scrub it, paint it, repair it. And it's just like I said, little subtle details the movie puts in, but it doesn't say anything about them, which I really, really enjoyed. There's also a really brief scene that you see black soldiers being taken prisoner in Charleston while it's under siege, which shows, one of the darker parts of the Confederate cause. A lot of these black soldiers were taken prisoner. Some of them were just killed outright, and some of them were actually impressed in becoming slaves again. Like I said, the whole racial element to the Confederacy, which was really interesting. But yeah, I thought that was a really cool part about it, and I think this is overall a really enjoyable movie. I thought it was very accurate. I thought the story was really interesting. This movie, in my opinion, I don't think is trying too much to endorse the Confederacy. There's a few scenes here and there I kind of question, but that being said, I do like this movie for the most part, and I think the story of the Hunley is engaging. I thought that the whole thing, especially how they eventually succeeded in blowing up the ship at the end of the movie, and like I said, like the movie also states at the end, the Hunley was a pioneering maritime ship or submarine. It arguably pioneered what would soon become, especially in World War I, a huge new genre of warfare, the submarine warfare that was especially prevalent almost 50 years later in the World War I time period. But yeah, I think overall this is a pretty solid movie. But let's get into some of my cons. It's not perfect. It's not a 10 out of 10. I do like some of the characters, but I do think I wish there was a little bit more to be analyzed with the other members. I think Dixon was a very good, strong character, but I would have liked to know more about the crew. And I think that was a bit of a disappointment that we didn't get to see the other side of the coin with them. And even though the movie doesn't flat out endorse the Confederate cause, there's those nice subtle details like I mentioned. There is one scene in particular where they all start singing the Bonnie Blue Flag or the Bonnie Star song that was created in 1861. And that was obviously a very much, wasn't like an official anthem, but it was a very popular tune in the South. And I felt that scene a little bit it felt a little bit like, oh yeah, the South is fighting for something a little bit more right. You know, they're all singing a song. It's a very uplifting moment in the movie. And I felt that was a little bit odd. I was like, that's kind of weird. And, it's like I said, the movie is very focused on the Hunley and the mission and doesn't really get too much into the politics of the time. And that's fine. I think that's a good way to view this movie. I do think a little bit more about the Confederate cause could have been maybe explored with some of the characters a little bit more, especially with scenes with Beauregard and, like I said, that weird scene with the Bonnie Blue flag. It kind of, like I said, a little bit glamorizes the Southern point of view a little bit, and I think it's a little bit dangerous. It's, like I said, not a horrible thing, doesn't destroy it. We don't have another gods and generals here, so to speak, but, it does, like I said, feel a little off. But, I think overall, though, this is still a really solid Civil War movie. It does keep its focus very narrow. It doesn't, I don't think, glorify the Confederate cause too much, even though there's a few weird scenes here and there. I think it's mainly focused on the Hunley and Dixon's character arc, and that was very solid, and I think it makes for a very good and underrated movie. Now, one of the other issues with this movie is also just kind of how hard it is to see it. I was able to view a copy of it on the internet, but it's actually a little bit difficult to get your hands on it. So that's why it's kind of a more rare TV, movie to get. Like I said, it did air only on TV and, was a bit harder to find. But that being said, this is a very underrated Civil War movie. It does glamorize the South a little bit, which I don't like at all. I think the Confederates... I think the fact that the Confederates lost, I think made the world for a better place. And like I said, anything glamorizing their cause, I don't like. Just my personal feelings on the matter. But I think the story, when it's just focused on the Hunley, makes for a very engaging watch. But yeah, my thoughts on the Hunley from 1999, the TV movie. Hopefully you all have a good day and peace, y'all.